Hello, my name is Kelsey Harrison. This evening I will be very briefly addressing approaching developmental psychology from the viewpoint of integration. More specifically, I will be discussing the appropriateness of the integration viewpoint and considering areas of complex developmental trauma and caregiver-child attachment. The onset of modern psychology created a tension between Christianity and psychology. And while the field of secular psychology has somewhat overwhelmingly solidified its position as one of staunch rejection towards Christianity, for followers of Jesus, this tension is not so easily reconciled. And to date, efforts have been made to ameliorate or reconcile that tension. And within the evangelical church, there are 5 generally accepted views regarding this idea of integrating Christianity and psychology. And each one has a unique stance on scripture, science, sources of knowledge, the overall goals and aims of psychology, and to whom or to what one ought to assign the greatest sense of credibility and authority. So for our purposes today, we're going to focus solely on the integration viewpoint. And the integration viewpoint sees science and scripture both as valid sources of knowledge, holding that when interpreted accurately, these two entities are mutually affirming. In other words, one does not contradict the other. The integrationist recognizes, however, that scripture in and of itself is not sufficient to adequately address all facets of the human condition. Additionally, they recognize man's ability to misinterpret or misconstrue biblical teaching and the interpretation of scripture. And so as such, they really value empirical data and champion rigorous scientific endeavors and scientific research. They reject a true neutrality in psychological research, maintaining that it's essential to have a worldview in order for any data to have purpose, meaning, or a construct. They also push back against dualism that some of the other viewpoints hold and really do seek to integrate the two. They maintain a strong biblical foundation, and they view psychology as descriptive and prescriptive in practice. In other words, psychology is to help us understand human nature and also to help in improving the lives of God's people. The specific research areas of interest that I would like to pursue are caregiver-child attachment, complex developmental trauma and early childhood adversity, foster care and adoption, and the neurobiology of trauma. And so looking at the caregiver-child attachment, looking how as the caregiver moves towards the child, what happens to the child's nervous system, what happens to their neurotransmitters, what happens to their emotions, and when those needs aren't met, what is the effect across the lifespan for that child? How does a practitioner come alongside of a caregiver-child dyad and work to repair that attachment, right? There is robust literature indicating the harm of disrupted or insecure attachments, and less research identifying the most effective and efficient ways to support repairing those systems. Complex developmental trauma and early childhood adversity. What is the effect of toxic stress prenatally at different developmental ages? How do we support a child in returning to a normal developmental trajectory in the wake of such hardship? What supports children in being resilient against adversity? And specifically in the context of foster care and adoption, recognizing full well that trauma occurs outside of child welfare settings, but that for kiddos who are in a position to be in foster care or to be adopted, that their risk of experiencing a disrupted attachment and significant adversity is much higher. And then finally, the neurobiology of trauma. How does trauma affect a child's body? And how does it stay with them? And more importantly, what do we do about that? How do we support a child or family in moving towards health and wholeness? Integration is the most appropriate viewpoint with which to address this type of research for a number of reasons. Scripture provides a very solid framework and foundation for our understanding of the value of individuals and families, how we ought to come alongside of others, care for them, serve them, protect the vulnerable. In other words, it tells us very clearly where we are trying to go, right? Because God's children are created in His image on purpose, for a purpose, with inherent, immutable worth, because He has initiated redemption through His work on the cross. That's our goal. We're supporting children and families in moving towards help, wholeness, and redemption. However, Scripture is not explicitly prescriptive in addressing things like insecure attachment or complex developmental trauma. While it is profoundly beneficial in creating a framework and guidelines, the specific mechanisms of redemption, right, for the child from a hard place, is not clearly addressed in Scripture. And so when the believer can hold the guiding principles in one hand of Scripture and in the other sound empirical data and psychological research, then he or she becomes truly equipped to serve as a minister of reconciliation. And understanding the structure and direction of creation is really essential here. And so the belief that everything that God created is good because He said that it is good. And then the fall initiated a move away from that goodness, a move of all things, away from the inherent goodness of its original design. So creation is continuously moving either away from or towards that inherent goodness. And for the practitioner serving as a minister of reconciliation in the context of psychological research and practice, this is really what we get to do. When we have data that helps us understand the mechanics of redemption, the mechanics of reconciliation, we can support children in moving along that continuum closer to the inherent goodness of their original design. And so, for example, here's what that looks like. Data tells us that in the context of a relationship, when a child feels safe with a caregiver, her nervous system starts to heal and respond to stress appropriately. And so that sympathetic nervous system is calmed by the parasympathetic nervous system, which is activated by the comfort of a loving caregiver. And so science helps us understand how we are helping families move towards redemption. And for this reason, the integration approach is highly appropriate for those practicing in the public square, where maybe there are limitations around what can and can't be said and what can and can't be done. And so the believing practitioner can really rest solidly on the truth that he or she is doing the work of redemption and the work of reconciliation as we are tasked with doing as believers, regardless of the language that's put around that work. In closing, the integration viewpoint is most appropriate to be applied in a developmental psychology setting, specifically exploring caregiver-child attachment and complex developmental trauma, because while a biblical worldview provides a framework for understanding children, families, adversity, and redemption, psychological science provides insight into the mechanics and mechanisms of that redemption and gives the practitioner tangible tools and interventions to support them in their work of redemption. An integration approach is essential to supporting vulnerable children and families in moving towards healing and wholeness. Thank you.